Oh, sailor, have you found your perfect sea?
The theme of this is called the prison of the ism. The prison of the ism. Let me clarify again why I'm doing this set of talks, so that you can see how this fits into what I've already been talking about, because it is part of a bigger mosaic. Because really what I'm trying to do in a series of talks is immerse you into a style of thinking that is simultaneously more philosophical but also somewhat critical of philosophy. And that's because we think before we philosophize. Philosophy is really a way of organizing your thoughts. Your thoughts are the associations and inferences you make upon them and insights you have, which are also due to the associations you have, that you get from the information at your disposal. That information can come from the world, it can come from a conversation, that is, it can come from the natural world, it can come from your memory, it can come from all manner of sources. And there is a danger that because we want to organize our thinking in a way that enhances our various capacities within the world, that makes us be able to achieve more, though there's some people who just want to have a suicide wish. That's something else as well. That's another way in which thought can seize you, or the conditions of life can seize you in such a way that your way of thinking will become very destructive. But if you're interested in trying to understand more about the world and participate within it in a manner that's more conducive to what you value, what you think will make the world, and your place in the world, more, I want to say enjoyable, but that's not quite right. Let's say convivial, to make the world a little bit more lovable, your place in the world more lovable, you more lovable as a person. Note, I'm not really using moral language, and that will become clearer later, because that's not the kind of language that philosophers normally would use. A term like conviviality, for example. The joyous, infectious enthusiasm, loveliness, if you like, of relationships that you have and your participations in life. Okay, so thinking involves all these associations that you have with the information that you have. And what philosophy can do is help you organize that information, organize those associations. Now, the way I've just described philosophy is what I would say is a more minimalist position than what a lot of philosophers want to do with philosophers. Because a lot of philosophers want, in some way, shape or form, to set up a philosophy as the philosophy, and if you follow this way of thinking, you will get to something called the truth. Now, there are many truths out there, and any situation, and this is a very philosophical word that's come into everyday parlance, any object, see the word object, see, as soon as I say a word like object, I start to cogitate upon it, and the first thing I notice about it is because it applies to everything, it's not really worth that much as a term. There's an imprecision about it of a sort that facilitates abstractness, and one of the things I'm hoping to convey to you in this series of talks is the danger of abstractness, which might seem funny given I'm talking about organising thoughts, and we tend to think of the more we think, the more abstract we become. Well, yes and no. So let's just say there's good abstractions and bad abstractions, and the abstractions have their moment, but they shouldn't take over us. And last week when I was talking about ideology, to me, underneath it all, underneath every ideology, it doesn't really matter which ideology it is. The thing that I find deeply demeaning of the human spirit, shrinking of the human heart and soul, is it oversimplifies things, and we've accepted a limitation that we should not accept. So when I'm talking about the prison of the ism, I'll explain what I mean by ism in a minute. Let me just say something about the prison side of this. I'm talking about a kind of mental captivity that we enter into if we decide to think a certain way. If we just take it on board and restrict ourselves to that. Now, in saying that, I'm not suggesting that being out of prison will be so great that everything will be good. You just think of someone who's in prison and then they get out of prison, they can still mess up their life. Life is one trial after another. There's a never-ending set of opportunities for you to mess up. What a prison does is limits the opportunities you have to mess up, but other dangers occur to you in there, and other limitations occur to you in there. And in a way, that's really what I think of ism thinking, that it puts you in a position where you have a different set of operations and routines, which you may get very used to. They may be even comforting, but there's these dangers that are inherent in that condition, and ultimately there's a limit that's completely unnecessary, and I think is shrinking of the spirit of anybody that has it. And because we live in a world in which one ism definitely prevails, and this is the ism that was used during the time of the French Revolution, and Thomas Carlyle in his very lively book on the French Revolution uses it, but I thought he coined it, but someone else used it before him, and that is the idea of philosophism, that the world should be conform to a philosophy. Our institutions should conform to philosophy. Our disciplines, etc., should conform to philosophy. Even the sciences were originally called, what we call the natural sciences, were originally called natural philosophy. So there was an extension of that. So there's a certain kind of truth, up to a point, that modernity has far more philosophy circulating with its institutions and with our normal vocabulary. I use the word object, subject, object. They come from out of a philosophical language, but no one thinks of that anymore because it's become part of everyday speech. So there is, though, and this is my point, there is a real danger that the philosophical, remember, philosophy is just organising your thoughts, that you become so obsessed with the how of the organisation that you start to think that that is more real than the reality within which you participate, which you make. Because it is true that the organisation does help make. It does help make things. The question is, how much better are they, and how limited are they in comparison to what is made when we're just making without that? And that's the difference between the imagination and free play and a philosophical tone. So, when I'm talking now about ism thinking, so let me take it back a step. When I'm talking about the prison of the ism, if you like, philosophy gives you the prison as well as the ism. And I'm interested in how you might be more philosophical without being a captive of philosophy. How you don't go to prison with philosophy and you don't constrain your thought to what I'm calling ism thinking. Let me focus upon the ism. We're all familiar with such words as, I used one, philosophism, which is not one that you'd be so familiar with, but such words as nihilism, relativism, absolutism. I'm going to talk about absolutism and relativism. I'm going to talk also about the other two that I think are particularly pernicious and particularly ubiquitous in the modern condition, and that's determinism and voluntarism. Note, in both of them I've given you pairs, and they are paired relationships in which philosophers will tend to say, gravitate to one position rather than the other. And what they do is they set up an argument as if this other position, for example, relativism, is a kind of lunacy, or voluntarism is a kind of lunacy, or determinism is a kind of lunacy, or it's just totally wrong. And I think these twin pairs have been very, very conspicuous within philosophy, and I think they've done a lot of damage. And I think they illustrate the way in which the crafting of a certain philosophical vocabulary Remember, a vocabulary that's meant to help you associate the information you have better, or help you even excavate information you may not have been able to garner, or even generate information you may not have been able to generate. It's able to help you that. So it's a very powerful thing. But if you limit your creative, your imaginative capacities to doing that, then I think you've really lost something. And as a species, we really stand to lose something if what we end up doing is becoming a kind of society based upon ideological conformity, which reproduces itself through the ideas and the reasons which are ideologically accepted. That's bringing us back to last week. It's also bringing us back to the week before, when we're just talking about ideas. I think that was the week before, when we're just talking about ideas, ideology, and now isms. And in a way, they're variants of the same thing. But in the case of ism thinking, there's two ways we can talk about isms. I think there's two general ways of talking about it. One is that we have looked into, observed, come up with, know the essence of things, of all things. We've seen the world. And philosophers often, and that's a metaphysics, and I'll explain what metaphysics is in a moment, but it means, and the philosopher Franz Rosenzweig makes this point, and he's a philosopher I like very much, Jewish philosopher, very smart, and he has an anthropological dimension to him which I think gives him a certain strength that's often lacking in other philosophers. Anyway, Rosenzweig saw that ism thinking is generally an essentializing of the world, and to have that essence, to believe that you've penetrated into the essence of things, ultimately means you're a know-all. You know the all. That's a phrase I've used before, and I will use it again. You know the all, because you've seen the ism. You know, for example, that the world is materialist, that the doctrine of materialism is what you need to fathom the world. Or it's idealist. Idealism is a kind of ism that you need, or realism is the kind of ism that you need, or transcendental idealism is the word you need, or dualism, or monism. These are all terms that come out of philosophy. Spinozism, Hegelianism, Marxism. So you see that. Now, as I moved from more general things, you noticed that I started to use, names of people. Because very often what happens, and that goes back to what we were talking about character a few lectures back, is that people being what people are, they will tend to be inspired by someone's insights and make themselves a follower of those insights. And in the case of a very towering figure who believes that they've unlocked the essence of history or the essence of reason, Marx, Hegel, for example, then it's very easy, because they show people who don't have various associations, a way in which to associate information which they find compelling. Now, I think it's great to go and read all these people. You should read these people if you're interested in philosophy. But I think that if you become beholden to any one of them, you've forgotten the most fundamental thing that you need to remember. And that is, we all are, our insights are always partial, and no matter how big we are, how smart we are, we've got little pea brains. And the smartest of us have more like a Brussels sprout. But the rest of us have got peas. And that's simply because there's so much world. There's so much out there, and we're just a little bit. And it doesn't matter how many books you've read. I know I've said this before, but I'll say it again and again. How many books you've read. I mean, I find insufferable people because they've read. I don't care if they've read 20,000 books. Often the more they've read, the more pompous they are. But they've focused on that, which means they've missed that. That's life. The economists call this opportunity cost. That's what we do. We do this, which means we're not doing that. If I'm learning ballet, I'm not learning how to be a boxer. That's the kind of simplification, obviously, but the kind of choices. If I'm studying physics, I'm not studying poetry. Sometimes I'm smart enough and have enough time, but there's only so many hours in the day anyway. We're limited. We can be a Brussels sprout or a pea. Good. Take a choice. It's great. Yeah, it's better to be, to have a bigger brain, do more, but it doesn't matter how big it is, it's still limited. Ism thinking is a way of cutting through the fact that you're a Brussels sprout or pea brain and thinking that your brain is as big as the world. It's a way of thinking you know it all because you've seen what's essential. Now, even this word essence or what's essential, that's something that can be helpful and it's something that can be imprisoning. It's helpful when you realize that there's a certain pattern of things, and if you follow this idea, you'll start to see a lot of things. That's a good thing. That's a very good thing. Essences are very helpful. But they're not helpful if you think that they exist solely to the exclusion of all these other ways of looking and other ways of seeing. Now, I can hear someone saying, oh, wow, that's really a relativist. It's so pluralist. Well, it is pluralistic, but it doesn't mean they're all of equal value. You can only know the value of an insight through the discussion and the observation and the encounter and the engagement. You need dialogue. And at the end of the day, the kind of thinking that I think matters is dialogical. It's one in which we pool our thoughts. We may dispute vigorously about what we think. We may observe serious errors in other people's thinking, and then may, if we're lucky, observe serious errors in what we're thinking, and we can somehow move along to get a better picture of things. But if I'm dealing with someone who essentializes everything, or has got one big essence, one big ism, and they want to go out from there, I've really got a problem. And you've got a problem because they basically know everything. Now, I used the word ism in the lecture on ideology last week. I used a lot of isms in that lecture, but one in particular I used was clientelism. Now that's a good example for me of a way in which you can see that there's a certain grouping or a certain set of practices. And you may remember I said the people that do clientelism don't even call themselves clientelists. A little bit like, when feminists called men male chauvinists. There weren't men going around going, I'm a chauvinist. But when feminists said, oh, you're a chauvinist, that word stuck. Now what had happened then is a certain set of practices became folded within a name. That is, or we used a name to help us take note of a certain set of practices which were considered to be undesirable, and that went into social circulation and had a big effect, and some of that was very good. And although I don't like ism, and there's a lot, I think, like any ism that the feminists have problems with, I think that was a useful thing. Now there's also, so it can be a name we give to a group of practices that we see an identification within the practices or commonality within the practices that other people haven't noted. And we can do it in a critical way like chauvinism, and I use the word clientelism because the people who do clientelism don't think that they are clientelists. They don't think they're recruiting clients, and I do. On the other hand, there's people adopt a designation so that they can be part of a group. Feminists, for example, socialists, conservatives, I belong to this team. My thoughts are predicated around achieving these goals. These are my objectives. This is my program. So it's a kind of programmatic thinking. That's somewhat different to the essentialism that I was talking about, but it can, if you move from being, say, I'll take the example of feminism, someone who wants to argue against certain impediments to certain practices that women want to engage in, to a view of history in which you see that the only relationships between men and women that really ever existed were ones that were patriarchal in the sense of exclusive, oppressive, etc. I think you need to go back and do more history. I think that's a great oversimplification. And what's, in this case, the ism has involved you in the oversimplification. So you've moved from being part of a group that has a certain set of concerns which designates itself under this ism-ist term, and then you start getting caught up in the narrative circulating within that group, and then you describe all of history, the entire world, through these terms, and you end up, of course, just now entertaining fantasies about what the world would be like if these things that you've seen everywhere could be overcome. It's a know-allism that is a reductionism that ultimately doesn't help us cooperate more, learn more, engage more, because we'll only learn more if we are able to instruct each other, not just one group instructing us. And again, this is something I'm really hoping to come out in these lectures or talks, is that we keep coming back to our ignorance, and we keep coming back to the need to collaborate and cooperate, which can also mean dissent from and engage vigorously with in a dialogical manner, so that we ourselves can learn, because we ourselves know all too little. Coming back, so what I've given you there is an ism that's kind of a group identity. You could say it's political. It can be ideological. It need not be ideological. Essentialism, for example, is something that pertains to all ideologies, but it's not in itself a particular ideology in the way that feminism or conservatism or fascism or liberalism or whatever Marxism are. Now, very closely related to this is the idea of metaphysics. And the term we usually associate, anyone who's talking about its history will associate that with Aristotle, and he was talking about a first philosophy. The term itself was actually came up with by a librarian who was classifying the works of Aristotle, and the work that Aristotle wrote on the first philosophy, a series of lectures, was put after a work called the Physics, and it was called the Metaphysics, after the Physics. So it kind of one of those fortuitous coinages of a name, because what we tend to do when we think of metaphysics is not so much after, it's actually a kind of preceding, but it's the kind of place upon which, it's a way of thinking upon which other disciplines, other thought edifices, other sciences rest. The great, and if you've interested in this, and I've got many disagreements with this philosopher, but he is great in his own way, and he's given a fantastic, I'd say series of lectures, but they're published really as a whole collection of books on the history of metaphysics. Is a guy called Martin Heidegger. And his stuff on the history of metaphysics is really, really very powerful and very good. Unfortunately, Heidegger's alternative to metaphysics is poetry of a certain stamp. And I think he misses the opportunity to just embrace the revelatory nature of language itself, the way in which just by talking and listening and thinking about words and observing the world, you don't need a poet, even though poets do indeed can coin certain names and phrases, and so much Shakespeare, for so many phrases we use, for example, come from Shakespeare. But there's so much language, isn't there? It's far richer than the one Brussels sprout mind. In the case of Shakespeare, we talk about a whole cabbage rather than a Brussels sprout, but you know what I mean. Okay, so metaphysics is basically the first philosophy. It lays down the unassailable, unconditional principles from which the rest of our understanding of beings in the world, of what is in the world, of what constitutes reality, flows from. Metaphysics is simultaneously something that's fascinating, intriguing, illuminating, and to be used with great caution. To me, it's a little bit like nitroglycerine. Too much of it and you start blowing things up. So, when I'm talking about ism thinking, if one, for example, is a materialist or an idealist or a realist one is engaging in a kind of metaphysics. And a metaphysics is exactly the philosophy that's dedicated to trying to give us the principles that explain everything, that explain the all. But of course the world is full of so many different things that if I say I know everything, you don't know anything about what I know. You don't know if I know actually anything. I know everything. Well, tell me one thing that you know. Can you speak French? Do you know how to to read Latin? Can you play guitar? All the different kinds of knowing that you do. Now, the one valuable thing about studying metaphysics is that it enables you to detect when someone is making their associations, when making certain claims. So they're thinking and making claims about things, instructing us or directing us or telling us what to think or bullying us or whatever. We can see in the way they're putting their thoughts together. If we have a good grasp of metaphysics, we may see, it doesn't always follow, but we may see that certain moves they're making are only possible because they've assumed something. And what they've assumed is the metaphysic, that they are basically operating on the basis of some more elementary, fundamental thoughts, first philosophy, which they have taken for granted. Some of them may actually come out and be overtly, for example, Karl Marx comes out and says, I am a materialist and this is what it means. Okay. Or Descartes will tell you why he's a dualist, and you can trace his argument and you can accept it or not accept it or whatever. So it's, but a lot of people say things and that if what they're saying is true, it's only because something else that they haven't said is true. Something else that they haven't said is true. And the whole impetus for this series of lectures was really to focus upon the kinds of oversights we have that come about because we were making certain assumptions that are absolutely unwarranted. And very often those assumptions are metaphysical. Now, in some ways, although last week when I was talking about ideology, I was emphasizing how pernicious I think ideology is or can be. And, it can lead to people killing each other. In some ways, metaphysics can be even more pernicious because it's easier to be a captive of a metaphysic without even knowing it, because you just think that's the way things are, and you keep repeating it and you keep saying things and you're convinced that they're true, but the truth of them, as I said, depends upon something else being true which you haven't even considered. And let's be honest, most people that have very strong ideological stands on things aren't that philosophical. The Marxists in the main tended to have more people battling philosophically on their side than most other ideologies. But it didn't mean it was any good because the philosophy wasn't very good. But that's another point. But if I think of the stuff that is considered progressivist today, I can see that there's not many people have come out talking about the ideology behind, say, identity. Sorry, the metaphysics behind their view of identity. And and they should, because it's absolutely metaphysical. It's a terrible thought. It's a simplistic thought. But it's predicated upon a certain understanding of what an identity would be, or what a difference would be, of what is the value of a difference. Their own PR about their importance, and they were very happy to issue statements about diversity, equity, hierarchy, elitism, all issued by people, on huge salaries. It was a complete and utter scam. But the point I want to make with going into that is it was ideological and it was metaphysical. And did any of them know the metaphysics? No. No, they did not. One of the things that started to happen, for example, was this with total quality management. I don't want to go on too much about it, but it is relevant. So they were wanting to say the way to be good at this, the way to be a good teacher, is to break down the practices into various items. So that's the Cartesian method. Anyone who knows Descartes is you break things down into the simplest parts and then you put them together. And anybody who's a real teacher knows that you can't do that. That something gets missing, and it's the spirit of the conversation. It's the spirit of the engagement. It's a little bit like thinking that I can put together a body if I've got an arm, a leg, and I end up with what Dr. Frankenstein did, but I'm not ending up with a living human being. And this is how we were being asked to approach our teaching and indeed our writing and what mattered in writing. So the whole institution had become captive. And it was based, in that instance, it was really based upon Cartesian metaphysics. Okay, about the Cartesian method, which itself is sustained and supported by a certain metaphysics. I can go into that in more depth when I talk about managerialism. But metaphysics, the danger is it's pernicious. Now, I want to talk, for the rest of this ism lecture, I want to talk about 4 isms or 2 pairs of isms. The first I'll take the earliest one first, absolutism and relativism. So this is the kind of metaphysical divide, and we can really go back to Parmenides or Plato as being early philosophers who've argued for the fact that if there is a truth, it must be absolute. So that there are some principles, ways of knowing, so the way of knowing itself, what philosophy is, and especially, and this is where we tend to find it most, especially when we talk about one or two things. Either a perception and its relationship to what something is. So is a perception I have true or is it false? Or a moral judgment about something. And we see this in Plato, but it tends to, if anyone has studied first year philosophy, they would come across these terms very early on. And anyone who's studied the humanities would probably pick up very quickly that in the main, those that have studied philosophy tend to see relativism as something really bad, and those that have studied anthropology tend to see absolutism as something really bad. That's very interesting because it suggests that the disciplines themselves have taken on or developed out of or in conjunction with certain set of metaphysical commitments. So the metaphysical commitment of the absolutist is to the idea that there is a truth, one truth, a way to that truth, and that applies as much to material objects, and so there is a science, if we but find it. It might be that we need to study sociobiology or genetics or physics, depending on what the particular issue. There's a particular science we need to follow to get access to the nature of something. And when it comes to moral judgments, ethical judgments, for the moment I'll use them interchangeably. They can be used differently, but I'll use these as one and the same, which is a more common thing that people do. So when we speak of I should not do this, or you should do this, or laying down rules that people can or should not do, you shouldn't sleep with your students, you shouldn't, you shouldn't kill people, you shouldn't steal, blah, 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 blah. All of these, by the way, ideas and values that don't look that different between different communities. Certain things don't look that different, but sometimes some things are very different. And try to understand why they're different, that's what the anthropologist does. And that's why very often the bugbear of the moral philosophers, especially coming out of the analytic tradition, the British Anglo-American analytic tradition, tends to be very, very critical of anthropology, and sometimes sociologists do the same thing, etc. That is, they tend to think different classes, different behaviours, you understand these different behaviours. Now, what's behind the absolutist position, what gives it kind of credibility, is, let's say, the extreme case. So the extreme case would be, and I've noticed this when I see philosophers who hang on to this position saying, well, what could you ever give me an argument for raping a 1-year-old baby? No, that's absolutely shocking. So the idea is that if you cannot accept that that is wrong, then obviously there's something wrong with the way you think. And if you accept, or if you will not accept that that is right, then you are clearly a relativist. And the absolutist will point out, if you can't accept that, then you're really being an absolutist about your relativism, so you're not really a relativist, you're really an absolutist of a sort. And a variation of that kind of argument was made by Plato, because Plato says in a dialogue of Plato's in which Socrates makes the argument. In the Protagoras, basically, Socrates says to Protagoras, who goes around teaching this doctrine of relativism, according to Plato, that I can say that you're wrong, but because you're a relativist, you have to accept that. But I don't have to accept what you say. So therefore, again, you're deferring to absolutism. And I don't think it's that hard to find something that all people would have some agreement with. Now, does this mean that truth is absolutist or not? And I would just say, I think this is a really unhelpful and rather silly game, because you've set up a pairing, absolutism versus relativism. So if it's not one, it must be the other. How about we just not talk that way? How about we just are quite prepared to say, if you think it's right to rape 1-year-olds, then you really have a problem. Carthaginians, for example, used to do child sacrifice, and the Romans were absolutely horrified by this. Now, the Romans did other things that, other people were horrified by, the gladiatorial games. It's a little bit, when the conquistadors came across the Aztecs, they saw that the Aztecs were pulling out human hearts of the victims in battle and sacrificing them to the god. And they were horrified by that, and then they would burn people at the stake for doing that, and that was horrifying to the other lot. So we can see that we're all capable of practices which become part of a culture and become acceptable routines, and they have a meaning. And this is why there is a serious problem. I think let me state it again. Absolutism and relativism is a really crap way to talk about a really serious issue. The serious issue is that human behaviour is such that in groups certain practices become acceptable, orthodox, and because they are meaningful. For example, the practice of clitorectomy. We know, for example, that the UN has all these stances about clitorectomy being bad. At the same time, the UN also has all these things about cultural rights. So it happily contradicts itself and not really able to do very much, but it does want to instruct people into the fact that clitorectomy is wrong. Now, the problem with that is not that I want to argue that clitorectomy is right. I'm just saying that doesn't really help anything, because what you've got is actually a social and political issue in which identity is so important to the people involved in the practice that some outsider telling them that it's wrong makes no difference to them. They will just carry on with the practice anyway, and they will just find it offensive or be offended that someone, grandma had it and she wants to hold down, the granddaughter, and the mother had it and she wants to hold, and their identity is bound up with seeing themselves in the world. It has a certain meaning. Part of grandma's function is to make sure that she has a place in the world by holding down the granddaughter to do this act. It's an act of mutation, sure, but it is also has social meaning. Now that doesn't mean, in fact, it's only if you say nonsense like all cultures are equal that you have a real, that you go, oh no, I don't know what to do about this. This is terrible. And if you're thinking at that level of abstraction, and the issue is, well, I can say, look, this I think is a practice that you've engaged in. It gives you meaning. And here's what happens. Here's the consequences of what you're doing. And if this person asks for help, I'm prepared to give it to them. If I'm a Western doctor and they ask for help, I would be prepared to help them, because I do think this practice is barbaric. But it doesn't, and I don't have to say, oh, it once, meant something so special and it's such a good practice. At the same time, I can also say, but I understand that this practice is very meaningful to these people. It's not a practice I agree with, but it doesn't matter that I agree with it or not. In a certain circumstance, it may matter, because I may have to make a decision, and I will make a decision. And the decision I've made, you could say it's simply because you're bound up in another culture, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, possibly, but I'm also able to make associations between the thoughts in circulation in my culture, because I can tell you a million things I think are shithouse in my culture, and I can tell you, a million things I think are really great in that culture, but this particular practice I think really sucks. And here's someone suffering, and I want to answer that. Now, that way I've just responded to strikes me as a far more the kind of thing that human beings tend to do when forced within circumstances. Again, I'll just give you another one. I might think that it's wrong that the border in the south of the US is not very well policed and people can just come in and have citizens. People can just come in and live there without going through the proper protocols. I might think that's wrong. At the same time, I meet Pedro or someone who's done that and they need help and the authorities are looking for them, and because of my relationship or something in my heart for Pedro, I'm going to help and shield him, and I'm going to disobey the law. Even though I think it's a good law, I'm prepared to disobey it. Why? Because we are creatures in which there's all these contingencies. In that case, I want to help Pedro. I don't want to open the floodgates and destroy, if I'm not even from the United States, but it's been, something that is a big deal over there. But I can see the problems and issues that have from not really having secure borders and not having proper protocols about who becomes a citizen or who's allowed into a country or not. And you say you contradict yourself, and you're terrific. Why would a lawful logic mean anything in living a life when life is nothing but contradictions? Life is nothing but this or that. Does that make you a relativist? Well, that's just not very helpful, because I certainly wouldn't agree to the fact that I think it's fine for 1-year-olds to be raped. I think clitorectomy is a really bad idea, but it doesn't matter that I think clitorectomy is a bad idea, because it's a cultural practice, and having these pompous asses lay down a set of rules of what should happen to this group over here, when they don't really know how to go about enforcing it. And clitorectomy is a good one. I'll just give you, when in Egypt President Mubarak was overthrown, because of the protests in 2011. A lot of people don't realise that one of the things that made him really unpopular was his wife was leading a program directed against clitorectomy. But the Western media wanted to set up what was happening, and it was a complete fantasy. It was disgraceful. Honestly, what journalists do sometimes, I think is just unconscionable. Because they present a picture to the world which all these other so-called educated people who know nothing about that part of the world just think can be explained in these pairs of opposition, good, opponents of regime, good, regime, very bad. So there's a tyrant and there's the people. And the people are all unified in wanting to oust the tyrant. This is basically the way the so-called Arab Spring was reported. It was nothing but lies and misinformation and stupidity. I'm not sure at which point which held the day, but it wasn't good. The fact was that interfering with a practice can create problems of a whole other sort that you hadn't foreseen. And in fact, let's get one thing straight, and here I'm going to give a definition of a human being. Human beings are problem-generating creatures. That's what we do. We generate one problem after the other, and a metaphysics will not help us solve it. So, absolutism and relativism. These two big words. In the case of Plato, he was looking for, as philosophers invariably always do, they're looking for some kind of moral absolute standard. But you'll start to notice that once the philosophers start doing this, they get caught up in more and more ridiculous examples. For example, the philosopher Immanuel Kant gives the example, this very famous example, of I'm hiding someone who is... I'm hiding someone from the authorities who's done nothing wrong. The authorities are bad lot. They come looking for him. They ask, is he here? Kant says, I must say yes, because that's a moral imperative. I cannot control what they do to the person I'm sheltering. But if I don't say yes, then I'm not recognising the human dignity or potential for human dignity in the potential assailant or brute, at my door. And you just think, what a complete idiot. If your philosophy has led you to make that decision, you need another philosophy. And in fact, in Kant's moral philosophy, which I find completely terrible, it's just all these grand sweeping statements, what he calls moral imperatives, in which the complexity of life and it's just overridden by the fact that we must not care about consequences, only with the purity of our maxim. Well, if you're that stupid, you want that, and philosophy can lead you into very stupid places. Well, bully for you. But I know that if, during the Nazi, everyone uses the Nazi, but I'll use it again. During Nazi times, if I had a Jew up in the cellar, or Jewish friends in the cellar, or people I just helping in the cellar, and the Nazi came looking to the door.
Cellar, attic.
Oh, that's not the cellar, is it? That's the loft. The loft. If I had them in the loft, I would lie, and the people would be very grateful, and their grandchildren would be very grateful, and the world would be different because I told that lie, and it would be better because I told that lie, because that person has sold their soul. And any talk of dignity, they've lost it. Dignity is something you should have to get back. You have to earn. You have trials and struggles to get it. You don't just have it, but that's another piece of nonsense as part of our moralistic world where these abstractions run away with each other, and we start to believe all sorts of, and do terrible things because we accept this nonsense. So the best argument, so there's certain arguments for absolutism and certain arguments for relativism. I said that anthropologists tend to be relativists. The great early pioneer of describing different cultural practices is the historian Herodotus. It's fantastic. Everybody should read him, because it's so lively, it's so thoughtful, it's so humane. It's this is not someone justifying, terrible things like what the Carthaginians did to their kids. But he appreciates that life in these different societies, the priorities have become a certain way, and because of the kind of creatures we are, we can get entangled in our priorities. And we're perfectly free to discuss these priorities with others and say, no, I think that's wrong, and then give our reasons. But that doesn't require me having some absolute standard on everything. And I keep using this term know-all. Absolutism and relativism are two sides of the same know-allism. And it is an ism, and it's an ism that people of a certain metaphysical and then sometimes ideological stripe embrace. Now the next one I want to talk about is determinism and voluntarism. So that one, absolutism and relativism, has an ancient pedigree. We can trace it back to Plato versus Protagoras, or Socrates versus Protagoras, Herodotus. Determinism and voluntarism they might not be terms as commonly found. Certainly the term voluntarism is not a term that's, I would say, widely used in first year philosophy classes. Determinism, more likely. But really they're two sides, and they're really very modern terms, even though so much modern philosophy is predicated upon a revival of ancient philosophies, and especially Stoicism and Epicureanism. I'll look that up if you want, and maybe some other place I'll talk about that, but that's not what interests me here. So it's not that they're completely without precedent. Nevertheless, what starts to define modern philosophy, and the first philosopher who's considered the outright founder of modern philosophy for very good reason, is René Descartes. And René Descartes basically wants to break down the universe into all its smallest components in order to re-put it together again. Remember, I gave that example before of these idiots in the administrators in the university transposing basically the Cartesian method into pedagogy and assessment and all these other areas that are just completely deranged. But in the case of Descartes, his reason for doing this is to understand nature as a completely law-governed totality, and then to be able to manipulate nature to control its mechanisms, because we ourselves are mechanism, but we're also, he's a dualist, so he also sees us as having a mind, and our mind consists of these cognitive capacities like a bundle, and that bundle is not physical, it's mental. And of course you can, in some ways that is quite right, that the mind, you don't see the mind, you can see evidence of the mind at work, or even more evidence of mindlessness at work, but you can see evidence of it, but you don't ever see the mind. And then you can do things like you can, I've used the term imagination, but you can make inferences. There's various capacities you can attribute to the mind. The mind can do this, and then they are considered to be part of its functions, and they are components of the mind. So Descartes, in wanting to remake our world on the basis of the little machines that constitute the world, or the machine part that constitute the world, so that ultimately we can live possibly forever, he suggests this, and certainly that we can ease ourselves so we don't have to labour so much, so machines can do the work for us. So it's a very modern picture that Descartes has about the way the world could be. And it's basically a picture in which the primary goal, unlike the virtues of various philosophers going back to the ancient world, Descartes' objective is comfort, a comfortable existence. And every time I hear someone say, I'm not really in a university setting especially, or academic setting, I'm not really comfortable with you, I get so angry. I think, what an idiot. Why should you be comfortable? But I also think, yeah, that's Descartes. That's the way Descartes' influence is kind of seeped through. We think comfort is what the name of the game is. And, generally, not many people thought that comfort was the name of the game. And usually those that did were the biggest scoundrels in a society. So we've made a society of scoundrels. What he set up is a world of cause and effect. Everything has a cause. And although Descartes' philosophy had some followers, it was the most important influence he had was seeing the world in such a way that it was nothing but a totality of laws. His student, I don't even know if they met, but he started out as a student and then became a very big critic of Descartes, was a guy called Spinoza, and he rejected the dualism. John Locke is very critical of things to do with Descartes. So all these other, Leibniz, so a whole set of philosophers start to develop. But one thing they all have in common is they tend to see the world in naturalistic terms. Leave out Leibniz. He's my favourite and the most complicated. In this view, everything is determined by something else. Now, we're so used to seeing the universe as governed by laws that this perhaps does not strike us as strange. And indeed, this can be very valuable. All sorts of facts, realities, technologies flow from this fundamental insight. And it's not actually it's not that Descartes was the first to go looking for laws of nature. I'm not saying that. Galileo, for example, big influence upon Descartes. But not even that. We can go back to Copernicus and, if we were to study the history of science, for example, a very famous scholar who did this was Thomas Kuhn. The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, very famous book in the 1960s. So he takes astronomy as the kind of master science, which then sets a template from which physics will develop, and then other sciences develop from that. So it's not that Descartes is the first in looking for laws in nature. And we notice also, what I just said then, very important, that why astronomy gets that pride of place. And astronomy, by the way, as an important science, was also recognised by Plato, who makes astronomy essential to the curriculum of philosophers in his book The Republic, when he's talking about philosopher kings and what education they need. But the point is that there you have an instance of regular motion. So it's the regularity of the motion sets down the template for what it is that you're looking for when you're looking for a law. That is, you're looking for something that you know will follow from something else. If this is in alignment, then this will be the case, etc. So this is as I said, very, very valuable. But what Descartes does is basically sees all of reality as consisting of only two things. One, I said, is the mind. The other is the body. It's an extended substance, according to him. And that view became kind of widely held. Spinoza reproduces it. Kant even uses it. Leibniz is, again, the one exception. Leibniz is so interesting. One day there's two thinkers, I'll just say this, there's two thinkers I could spend the next 15 years happily reading. and that's Leibniz and William Blake, and they are very, very different thinkers, very different, see very different things, but I think they're two of the real towering modern minds who tend not to be as well known as I wish they were. Okay, and I need to know, every time I look at them I think, wow, there's so much more, there's years and years of work that one can put into reading them. So, what Descartes has set up is a view in which, if it's not the mind, and the mind, I keep saying it, it's just a series of cognitive operations, then what we've got is reality, and if we could break down its mechanisms by studying its law of cause and effects, then we would understand what it is. Now, as Descartes was doing this, there was a general reaction amongst some other philosophers, including Francis Bacon, who's kind of a contemporary of Descartes. But I do not he's very important for the experimental method, as is Descartes, but the mathematical side of that method and the metaphysical side of that method is not really well developed in Descartes in the same way that it has the same kind of philosophical impact as Descartes. Though, that's not to say that Bacon doesn't have other impacts upon some thinkers I like very much, like Vico and Herder. And in some ways you might want to make the claim, might argue, that there's a lovely little magpie outside my window pecking at something, and I think that's, life is full of miracles, not just... Then the Cartesian world is a world in which there's no miracles, by the way. That's something one of the conclusions he draws. So in saying there's no miracles, what you're saying is that everything must have an explanation, everything must have a cause, and there's nothing that anyone or anything could do that is not caused by some other. In his case, he believed that bodies in motion. This would lead to a dispute between him and the Newtonians won, because of course there is a way in which bodies can affect each other without actually directly impacting on each other, and of course that's gravity. And Newton said, I don't know how it works, it just works. So Newton though he did embroil himself in certain metaphysical questions about the nature of time and space, he realised that, there's some things I just can't explain, but it doesn't make them untrue because I can't explain it. Whereas Descartes wants to have a template that will explain everything. He provides a method of how to go about doing things, and he has a metaphysics, and one of the things that occurs in his metaphysics, he sets up an idea of God, in which God really is little more than an idea, to keep the universe strictly governed by laws. Now, the other thing I wanted to say is that the other philosophers, including Descartes, they're reacting with great hostility against the influence of Aristotle, because Aristotle, who in the Middle Ages was simply known as the philosopher, his work was so widely appreciated and appropriated within the universities in Europe. And Aristotle had written a book called The Physics, and it was basically full of bad ideas about physics. But Aristotle's view of the world was very much based upon the study of living organisms, based upon creatures. And so when he would dissect a creature, a living thing, he would look at the parts in terms of their function. So he'd ask, what is the purpose of this part of a creature? Now, what the Cartesian view of the world did, and what this new deterministic view of nature did, it dispensed with any idea of functionality as such, and what was called final ends, or those kind of purposes in nature. Nature doesn't have a purpose, it just is what it is. And if you start looking for purposes, you won't be able to classify things, because you won't be able to see what impacts upon what. That's how Descartes thinks. Aristotle's thinking is also, you can see, it's very human-centric. you can see that, and intelligence is the most important thing in Aristotle. So the most intelligent creature, as far as Aristotle is concerned, us, is also the in a sense the apex of creation. And they're kind of, in a loose and wild way, you could say, oh, that fits the Bible's view, and that might help explain why Aristotle was absorbed in the universities and whatever. But what Aristotle had done was provide a method that was equally applicable to living organisms as to societies, because societies, we live in societies, and we are governed by our purposes. So it's no accident that to this day there are people that still take nourishment from Aristotle when they study politics or society, but not physics. You know, physics, he was finished. It's done. Now, were Descartes simply talking about specific laws of physics? His own interest was in meteorology and optics, medicine. Were he just doing that, the following criticism I'm going to make I would not make. Because I don't deny that it's quite useful, that it's extremely useful, first of all, to think of nature as nature, if I want to do physics or chemistry, and then try and discover the laws that make it happen. Now, we know that in the sciences of nature, there's very, very different methods. And some of them are far closer still to what Bacon was talking about with experiment. Even that Bacon was a critic of Aristotle as well. But in some ways, he reproduces the method of Aristotle, which is basically observation and inference based upon your observation. That's basically Aristotle's method, but he's got purposes thrown in there. With Descartes, though, that's not what you're doing. So the kind of sciences Descartes can be seen as a forefather of is something like, physics, obviously. What Kant had used the phrase apodictic. And that basically means there's principles that are inflexible and unassailable. If you go to something like science of the environment or metallurgy, and a whole other, you're studying ecosystems. There's lots and lots of sciences which are very much not that different from Bacon or even Aristotle. They're basically collecting information, classifying it on the basis of how they think things group together. But they're not looking at it in a way that the physicists do as a complete body in motion, for example. And if I say that, body in motion, and this is, when Galileo was coming up with the law of falling bodies, it didn't matter if he was dropping cats or balls or dogs or children. Morally it mattered, but in terms of the pace of the fall or the law governing the trajectile, that made no difference. A trajectile was a trajectile. And Descartes' thinking is very close to Galileo here. The thing that Descartes does, though, is move from the study of, or deploying a method that you could use to studying particular laws, to wanting to essentialize all of reality, to wanting to understand everything. And we might say this is a scientistic view of life. One of Descartes' contemporaries, famous thinker in his own right, very religious thinker, but very thoughtful man, is a guy called Blaise Pascal. And Pascal, if you studied computer science 40 years ago, the book that you studied with was called Pascal, and there was a program called Pascal, because he was seen as the forefather computing. Obviously pre-electronics and everything, but he's also did work on other scientific experiments on the vacuum, for example, I think, if I recall rightly. Now he was, in some ways, Pascal was a greater scientist than Descartes, but Pascal hated what Descartes had done about representing the universe in this mechanistic fashion. And for Pascal, we're somewhere between the infinite and a speck of dust. We're somewhere between, an angel or a speck of dust. And the solitary nature of this new universe, this mechanistic universe, is a very frightening thing. Because what had happened around this time is that, again, goes back to Copernicus, but a much more open picture of the universe, and hence they're just planets within planets within planets. Human life is just one other form of life. None of this matters very much. Now, there's no way of undoing that. And maybe it's a very good thing that it's been done. It opens us up, and the adventures of the cosmos before us, and Elon Musk and rockets and blah, blah. Okay, good. But what the danger is we shrink what we think is meaningful knowledge into ultimately what is physics. And I see the end of the Cartesian arc in the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. And after that, although there are philosophers that repeat in one form or another things that Descartes or Kant say, developments in philosophy that occurred subsequently mean that anyone that understands those developments simply cannot go back to what is ultimately a very reductivist view of life. And as I said, there's lots of people that repeat this, or a variant of it. They'll have a Spinozian version, because in the Spinoza doesn't allow for that dualism that Descartes has. But Descartes' dualism is really meaningless as a dualism, because all it is a set of cognitive operations, from which he does take the will as an important, which is going to be important to the next ism that I'm going to talk about, that is voluntarism. But which doesn't, in Descartes, actually do very much. It act like a switch going yes or no, yes or no. I accept this, I don't accept this, take this, which he sees that somewhere along the line in thinking, if you're setting up a method, you have to make a decision whether you go yes, no, yes, no. As I said, it's like an on-off switch. So this, with Kant uses this idea of experience, and you can see his view of experience is one in which a certain kind of experience, that is, the kind of template laid down by Newton, becomes the basis of what constitutes a real experience. And to just very briefly say that this will be the object of criticism in various ways. Hegel criticises it, Nietzsche criticises it, but perhaps the most thorough critique is by a guy called Edmund Husserl, who was the teacher of Martin Heidegger, and Heidegger, but it's Edmund Husserl, and he criticises this as naturalism. And I think Husserl is right, and if you read my book, you'll see why. A book on idolizing the idea. But what we can see in Kant is what constitutes knowledge is so, and what the way we classify it, it's so bound up with physics, even though he doesn't want to say that. He ends up then thinking, oh, what about aesthetics? So we have these compartments in Kant. We have metaphysics, which he's going to be the first to ground properly, because he doesn't think Descartes did a good job of that, or Locke, or Leibniz, or any of them. I think they did all a bad job, so he's going to get that right. Then there's physics, which basically he takes his cue from that to get the metaphysics, and Newton got that right. And then logic, which was also going to be necessary for metaphysics. He thinks Aristotle got that right, but the physics was wrong, so Newton plus Aristotle will get that right. And then you've got morals, because that's the bit that, we give ourselves moral laws, and this is voluntarism of a certain sort, but it's not of the sort that I'm going to be talking about so much, because ultimately what Kant is saying with our moral principles, they're based upon the will. The will is the only thing that can be absolutely good. It can be absolutely good because it is absolutely free, and because it's absolutely free, it means it's not impacted by these bodily stuff. And we can't even be sure it exists, but we know it cannot be disproven. And not being able to be disproven, we can think of ourselves as free, and we can give ourselves rules, maxims, which, for example, be equal, treat each other nicely, don't tell lies, including to Nazis coming looking for the Jews you've got in the loft. That's where that takes you. And then he comes up with aesthetics as well. And then he's got... I think it's, he's a brilliant guy, but at the end of the day, not a good way to think, not a helpful way to think. But he's trying to identify the limits of determinism. He realises that if everything is determined, and this idea comes up again in Nietzsche and Dostoevsky, variants on the same idea, but if everything is determined, then we don't have any responsibility, then surely it doesn't matter what we do, we can do what we like because we're just determined. Well, you see, that's a kind of conundrum you get into if you take metaphysics too seriously. It reminds me of Crime and Punishment, where Raskolnikov, thank you. Haven't read it for a long time, but just really wants to test this moral principle by committing murder. And a very similar thing happened with two young men in the United States in the 1920s or 30s, where they committed a murder to try and demonstrate the veracity of a principle of Nietzsche's. You can see these are very terrible ways to get lost, and you're only lost because you've accepted something which you cannot prove. You can't prove that the law is only law governed. Now, let me say, I think it's a very useful way to think, but the first thing you need to do is sort out what kind of things are we talking about when we're talking about this. This is why I like phenomenology, because phenomenology, its formulation is do the things themselves. I'm not saying Husserl doesn't have other problems, but in this I think he's right. So if I want to know, or if I want to make a choice, I'm at a restaurant. I go to so a determinist is trying to say everything you do is, we can find what it is that made you do what you've done. And of course, if you tried to build a world like that and live your life by that, you'd go completely mad. But for certain things, genetic predispositions, for example, that might be a very helpful way to do things. It only becomes a problem when you really buy the metaphysics, because it's not that there aren't laws. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is that everything we do requires some lawful explanation, or even has some lawful explanation. When I go to a restaurant and I look at, do I want spaghetti bolognese tonight? Do I want ice cream? Do I want, bangers and mash? Whatever I want. Is that because of some determinative principle? And I was thinking, this is really starts to get really silly. I can certainly, I think, no. Of course, character, occasion, opportunity, ambition, desire, all of these will affect decisions we make. I might want to get ahead in my career by pushing someone down the stairs. Or let's put it this way, I might know that if I push someone down the stairs and they can no longer perform the function, I'm going to be made head of the hospital or something like that. Now, will I do that? Well, you could say, well, that's determined by your character. I would say that your character has a lot to do with it, but the word determined is where I start to balk. I think you're claiming a little too much. Now, clearly in certain forums, and the law is a very good example of this, where someone has been so brutalised, we see that as a mitigating circumstances when coming to, for example, dishing out a sentence or how a crime is to be viewed. Of course it's not a bad thing that comes into the picture, because it has an impact. The question is, how much impact? And we all get in our lab coats and try and study exactly how much we were determined by this as opposed to this. And the issue is, even if determinism is true, it's not true insofar as we can never know all the determinants. And we would be mad to, and it's completely unnecessary. And a lot of what we do is more like sitting in a restaurant ordering a meal. We'll have this or that. And today I like the polka dot shirt, and tomorrow I like the striped shirt. Or, this fashion takes off in the 1960s, and by the 1980s it's a completely different fashion. This style of music happens, and you just realise that it's a very tunnel vision way of looking at things by thinking in terms of determinants. And we'd be better off saying a non-metaphysical term like this is an influence. This influences this. It may influence. It may even be decisive. You have to go and have a look. And in terms of, if you like, the science of this, it's far closer to Bacon or even Aristotle than it is to Descartes when you're talking about human affairs. And in the history of philosophy, whole branch of philosophers started to develop, and some of them, like William Dilthey, took off from Hegel, and they started to recognise, well, the human sciences and the role of history within it, that changes the game completely, because human creatures are symbolic creatures, and symbolic creatures, what's deterministic about me saying, you're a liar, and on one occasion I get really angry because of that word, or another occasion I laugh? Well, of course it depends on the circumstances, and I can read these circumstances, and that's why there is a whole body of philosophy called the hermeneutic, which is not quite, but it is kind of, it's about being attentive to the circumstances in which certain phrases, formulations, ideas circulate. So the language of determinism is one that you tend to find in ideologies of programmatic ideologies where you've got a group who's going to solve the world's problems by identifying what the determinants are and telling you how to fix them. And the two that immediately come to mind are any race-based ideologies, whether they're race-based in terms of the Nazis or now critical race theory. To me they're identical insofar as if they say that your race dictates what you can and must do, that's a double whammy on the stupidity front of metaphysics plus ideology. You've essentialized what a person is. Perhaps it is true that your race in certain contexts will matter a lot. In another context, it may not matter very much at all. It depends. But it's not the kind of thing that you can know in any context-free. There's no law about it. It's not something determinative. It's something that depends. It's cultural, it's personal, it's circumstantial. It's all sorts of things. But if you have a political objective that wants to make that everything, you will always see the same determinants at base in operation, and it'll come back to race. It was exactly what the Marxists did with class. For the Marxists, the bourgeoisie and the working class were deadly opposed to each other. It didn't matter that workers were competing with each other for position, that different skill sets are also in competition with other skill sets for certain kinds of economic preference. You know, all sorts of complexities were simply overridden by the fact that you saw things, or the Marxists saw things, as determined. What was determined was that the working class was being, in any engagement with the capitalist class, it was an exploited class. The exploitation was the essence of dictation or determination. And it's just not true. It's not to deny that there are tensions between classes. It's not to deny that capital and labour can be in serious conflict. It's not to deny that there can be capitalists who are complete monsters. But there are workers that can be complete monsters. You know, there's all sorts of ways of being monstrous. Interesting how now, with our ideological turn, that the working classes tend to be forgotten. And the working class now, in the United States, for example, the white members of it are just dismissed as white. Their class relation position doesn't matter anymore. So that's determinism. Now, remember me saying with Descartes, the will. There's the on-off switch of the will. Well, as the history of philosophy develops, the will takes on an increasingly important role. And the three most important, and I'll say four most important philosophers of will. One is Immanuel Kant, and that's the moral will. And I see his effect everywhere today. The second is he saw himself as the heir to Kant's thinking, but Kant was horrified when he saw the results of this, and they were so contrary to what he thought. Is a guy called Fichte. He's not that well known, and yet the reason I say he's important is because I think he actually does present a position that wasn't so widely read. He's very pompous and rather dry. Though, having said that, when the French had invaded the Germanic principalities, as they were then, his lectures were hugely important in providing the Germans with a sense of national consciousness. Perhaps some of the most important sets of speeches ever given to create national unity with the people. So he could be an orator which was apparently spellbinding to his audience at the time, but his books are rather tedious. But he was forgotten very quickly as well. He was forgotten very quickly. Marx, for example, there's no indication, he mentions him once or twice, but there's no indication he ever really even read him. And yet, I think Marx is very Fichtean. So, you know, I've got to leave Fichte, and the idea is he moves from what for Kant is purely the articulation of a moral principle that we should, if we can, if the determinants enable us, allow us, tolerate our putting into practice the maxim of our will. So we should strive to do that insofar as we can. Fichte takes that into seeing the world as but the expression of our moral willing, of our practical will. So he takes it way beyond the strictures of Kant. He still has variations on a moral type of imperative, but at the end of the day, the I is the centre of the fact act, and the world is but the fact act which larges. That is, my actions create the facts. And like any good philosopher, there's a certain truth in that. I'm looking at all these things in the room that have been created, you know, that people have made. And it's a fact that I've got this little pair of pliers in my hand. But it's an act that made that fact. And it's the willfulness that Fichte focuses upon. And he positions himself against the deterministic philosophy of Spinoza. In Kant, you've really got this balance. Determinism, physical world. Moral world, voluntarism, the will. By voluntarism, I simply mean a world made by the will. But it's purely a world of ideas. And then he tries to create a bridge, this is Kant, between art as kind of an admixture of our physical world and the ideas that we have. Ideas understood in a very specific sense, not just ideas that reproduce the images we have, but ideas we have about about human purposefulness and using art for human purposefulness, even though the quality of the art is ultimately indifferent to the purpose that we have for it. Okay, I don't want to get too far down that rabbit hole. But with Fichte, it's really the heroic will, the hero as creator. With the next one is Schopenhauer, Arthur Schopenhauer, who hated Fichte. Really, he hated Kant. He loved Plato and Kant. Everything he says about Plato and Kant, I think, is misleading or wildly wrong. Yet he takes things from them which they never intended, and he inserts it into his own philosophy. He hated Schelling, Fichte, Hegel with a passion. And in fact, he hated Hegel so much that when he finally got the opportunity to give lectures at the University of Berlin, he deliberately held them at the same time as Hegel was giving his lectures. And Hegel was, I sometimes call Hegel, sorry, it's really Hegel, but it's very Australianism of me. Anyway, he knew that Hegel was a hugely popular teacher. And he hated him so much because he thought Hegel was just a bureaucrat. He thought his whole philosophy was a philosophy of bureaucracy. And Hegel's philosophy, one of his expanding freedom. Schopenhauer's philosophy is of chaos, willfulness, destruction, tumult. There's no progress in history. It's just one piece of mayhem after the next. And I tell you, some days I'm really with Schopenhauer, other days I think there is kind of progress. So it depends on what side of the bed I've got up. Anyway, so Schopenhauer gave these lectures at the same time as Hegel. No students came to his lectures, not one, he couldn't get one. But the greatness of his teaching lay not in the fact that he had no students, but he did have one student, not who attended his lectures, but who came across his books, and his books had probably sold, a couple of hundred when that student came across him, and that was Friedrich Nietzsche, who also, when he first wrote, had no audience, but eventually had a massive audience. Unfortunately, what that audience did with him was not that great. And there's bits of Nietzsche that aren't that great, but there's other bits that are really great. And he's the fourth one. So in the case of Schopenhauer sees all of life as being driven by a blind will. It's its creative force. Its willfulness is a cosmic, not just as it was in Descartes, the on-off switch of the mind. Not just as it was in Kant, the sight of what he calls our practical reason, our moral imperatives, our moral preferences. But not just as though there is that bit of a side of it he shares with Fichte that he doesn't want to. But it's not just about the heroicness of our actions. It's about the cosmos itself. And we are driven to will. Our representations, the information we have, the knowledge we have, is driven by what we will. And I think Schopenhauer, as everyone knows, had a pet, a poodle. And I think, one thing you notice when you have a dog or a cat is how willful they are. And I've always thought Schopenhauer's philosophy comes from his circumstances of realizing that something is thinking that's alive It's thinking as acting, that is, by thinking it's representing things to itself, but it's not human. And he saw the whole universe in this way. And this idea takes off. And last thing I want to say is, and he saw this willfulness as a source of our misery, and Schopenhauer, very much like Buddhism and Hinduism. And he thought that the only way out of our predicament was a kind of escaping from the will. By the way, Martin Heidegger would later in his intellectual life would pretty well just redo Schopenhauer all over again without acknowledging it. But anyway, the way out of all this was to find a kind of mental calm, and that way the passion and the tumult of the will would cease. So you can see it's called pessimistic philosophy because it's basically wants to escape from the wheel of life, like that, as in the Eastern traditions. Now Nietzsche sees this idea of will. He also makes it cosmic. He also very heroic-like, even though he doesn't mention Fichte. And he comes up with this idea of the Superman and the higher man, which is, as I said, a variant of Fichte's, but he does it with determinism because in that Nietzsche also believes in eugenics, and it's something that most Nietzsche scholars in North America and the Western world completely ignore, but it's there. If you know anything about the history of eugenics, you'll see it all over Nietzsche. Anyway, so that's one lot of trajectory of this idea of voluntarism. So the will is the essence of all that matters. Now, when someone says, I see a system, and this system that you're within explains why you're doing what you're doing. So you're a racist because you're white, you live in this part of the world, that's why you're a racist. And I'm white and I can see that, but I may subconsciously be a racist, but I'm not really, and I can do things, I can attack my whiteness. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because this is so prevalent right now in our time. And it's such a terrible idea, and it's pure voluntarism. And I can overcome this because I recognise it. And what are you overcoming it with? Well, clearly it's your will. You can trace straight back from on the one hand, the determinism. On the other hand, just as Kant did, he wanted the moral will to get out of it. You have a moral will, but more like Fichte than Kant, you're ready to simply establish the facts on the basis of your act. And the acts on the basis of your act will be the willful acts that you have to rectify the situation so that you will be free of the burden of your racial prejudice, though others will have it because they're determined and you're not. You can see this is voluntarism pure and simple. The other most famous, I think, form of voluntarism, and in fact, no, let me clarify that and then I'll get to the other. I think all ideological politics of the sort that is so prevalent today, which instead of acknowledging the complexity and the accumulated problems and the tragic nature of the problems and the entanglements that come through our history, but the way of the determinants, the ways of thinking which identify a few elements, make them all important determinations, and then promise a way out by following the willful deliberations and program of a group. I think this is all voluntarist, and I think they're all the same, and they're all caught up in the same metaphysical overreach, the same lack of humility before the complexity of life, and the same philosophical hubris. Now, the other one I wanted to mention, and then I'll wrap it up, is Karl Marx. Karl Marx believed that he had identified the laws of history, and they were social and economic laws, just as he had identified the laws of capital. And in identifying the laws behind capitalism, he had believed that he had identified its trajectory, what was inevitable about its fate, what antagonisms it generated, and what resolution lay within its contradictions. It's a kind of Baudelaire version of Hegel. The problem that Marx had, and that all subsequent followers of him have had, is, first of all, he got the laws wrong because history didn't play out the way he said it would. According to Marx, had he been right that the working class would have got so poor in the developed world that they would have been forced to overthrow capital, which had become so monopolistic that there was an economic crash, the kind of which could only be resolved through the working class going into the various factories. And his mind is very much, it's very 19th century view of capital he's got, understandably. But they would go in, they'd take over the factories, and then they would produce whatever it is they wanted to produce, and everyone would live happily thereafter. And of course that is not what happened. There were economic crises, and there's bits of Marx that you could say could be used in an explanation of crises, though certain tensions between the classes. There's certain alliances that take place between certain members of the class. As I said, the working class doesn't itself all have the same sets of interests. Different people with different skill sets can be deeply in opposition to each other over wages, for example. So what Marx then, though, given that that didn't happen, the question was, live it up, go home. But what happened in Russia, for example, is although the conditions were nothing like Marx had explained, because capital was such a small part, and it was only really part of certain cities of the experience that was happening in Russia, or what was happening in Russia, the social and economic condition. Nevertheless, you had a student class, revolutionary class, wanting to take control of power, wanting to overthrow things, and they found in Marx a certain kind of recipe. But certain features they thought of the world, they thought they could be explained by Marx, but they had to deal with the fact that the world wasn't the way it was. So what did they rely upon? They went from being determinists to voluntarists, and that's my point. They relied upon their revolutionary will. Now, when Marx was criticised by an important revolutionary in Russia called Mikhail Bakunin, an anarchist, in some ways not a very great thinker, but he did see in Marx what it was. He said, this is going to be a red bureaucracy. It's a vile lie. Because the only way you can get what you want is have a mega state. Now, Marx wrote a riposte to this, saying, this is not true. You don't understand. There will only be revolution if the conditions are right, in which the outcome of which I predicted would occur. But at the same time, when Marx was written to by other revolutionaries in Russia saying, do you think we can use your method to understand what's going on? They said, oh yeah, of course you can. And well, the circumstances may be very different. It doesn't all have to follow. I didn't write down these eternal laws of the spirit, mocking the sort of Hegelian formulation that he's using. He's sort of mocking that. But that's exactly what he had done. So what voluntarism really is, at the end of the day, is it's the impatience of those and the ambition of those that think they can make the world fit their will. And the determinism is the observations of those who think they know, and I'm not talking about physical laws here, I'm talking about the human stuff, who think they know exactly why we do what we do. So on the one hand, they're determinists because they think they know why we do what they do. They've got an explanation for that. And on the other hand, they've got a way out, which is their own willfulness, and all we need to do is follow them. And we're back again to this clientelist ideology, which is what I think is the real ideology that was ever brewing within this determinist, voluntarist pairing, like two, Siamese twins. We do not have to give up on the idea that we have a human will. We do not have to give up on the idea that some things happen because they're made to happen, that there's a reason for them happening or some physical cause of them happening. Of course, that's true. It's when we make a metaphysics of this, and then it's even worse when the metaphysics becomes something we throw upon society, something that we use to dictate who has power over us and what we should do, that we end up making a prison of an ism. Thank you.